The Dossier of Dr. Shade, a Watchmaker's Timepiece, Episode 1. Written by Gabriel Rankin. Narrated by Aaron Miller. Science is always discovering odd scraps of magical wisdom and making a tremendous fuss about its cleverness. Aleister Crowley. Dorian Black focused on the page before him. A study concerning deific entities. Homework. The book itself was fairly inconsequential. It had been written by one of those Aleister Crowley wannabes who skimmed the works of John Dee and Helena Blavatsky, maybe listened to too much black metal. No, what gave Dorian goosebumps were the strange symbols and handwritten cuneiform script that occupied the margins in blue ink. All too familiar. The sigil of the fifth star was hewn in cerulean at the corners of every page. A 5-pointed asterisk connected to wedges at the apices of each line. It was not a comfort to see. One of those suits had given it to him, a real Bond villain-looking character he knew simply as 13. Dorian had decided years ago that the man was one of Ziggurat's more successful genetic experiments. His mechanical mannerisms were more than proof. He had met with 13 for the drop the night before. It was short notice, but that was always how it worked. Cornerstone had sent Dorian's handler to deliver a manila envelope and a book in a small, strong box to Dorian. 13, whose eyes flitted about in all directions like some bird of prey, had said, "This one comes straight from the top of the Ziggurat. They want it done right. If they are correct, and they usually are, this entity could be the big one. Cornerstone doesn't want another Cairo situation on our hands." Dorian scoffed. "I learned a lot that day. I'll never let myself lose another patient. Not like that." Dorian lit a lucky strike, and the reflection was a muzzle flash against his mirror-shade aviators, illuminating long gray hair that had been tied back in a topknot. A modern-day samurai, lacking the katana. He let the white smoke puff out as he spoke. "If it is what you say it is, then Cornerstone better be prepared to deal with it." Dorian had been skeptical about this assignment at first. They had been tracking that entity for years, with nothing to show for it other than a trail of bodies. Yet, as Dorian studied the pages of the book back in his apartment, he couldn't shake that overwhelming dread that accompanied an assignment like this. This was the event horizon. It was too late to turn back. The last time he had confronted an entity of this magnitude, it had taken Dorian to the very limits of his capability and his sanity. He pitied the poor wretch that this thing now inhabited. 13 had been right. This reeked of Cairo. That little girl. She didn't deserve her fate, but what could he have done? Facing an entity capable of breaking any known form of containment, given enough time, it was ready to unravel and attach itself to a new host at any moment. Dorian could still hear her screams. He wouldn't forget that, though he wished he could. Anyone with a clear conscience is either lying to themselves or misremembering. 5 years ago. The chopper touched down and the door slid open. 13 ducked as he approached, though Dorian supposed it could have been a reaction to the searing Egyptian sun wafting under the spinning rotor blades. Dorian donned his aviators, shielding his eyes from the tiny quartz kernels that blew across the helipad as he stepped onto North Africa. 13 began briefing him, shouting over the helicopter. "We have isolated the entity to prepare for your arrival. All who have interacted with it have done so with proper precautions, but," the helicopter lifted off behind them, We tried to take care of it ourselves. You were taking too long and—
Never mind the excuses. Just tell me who died.
Dorian pulled a lucky strike from his soft pack with his teeth. Then he flicked his Zippo and drew in a generous drag. The helicopter faded into the wind, and 13 said, "It was Milton. He removed his PPE for reasons we do not yet understand. We are still not sure how it got through his noise cancellation headset. Luckily, the non-terrestrial entity could not transfer to him." 13 shivered. Milton became convinced he was not meant to speak, like his vocal cords were not meant to be there. It was hard to understand what he was babbling about before he left us. Dorian stopped and turned to 13.
Don't tell me you let him out.
13 shook his head. Absolutely not. Though he pleaded through the one-way glass for us to open the door. Finally, he made it happen. You know how tight the protocols for dealing with NTEs are. We did not even let him take a pencil in there. Still, he managed to slash his own throat using his plastic keycard. 13 trailed off, looking like he was going to be sick.
It's likely he could read lips. He escaped a fate worse than death,
Dorian said as 13 ushered him through the heavy metal door that led into the Ziggurat's base of operations in Cairo. Once inside, the air conditioning and ceiling fans offered an almost startling change of environment. You cannot smoke in here, 13 said. Dorian took a final drag of his cigarette, then dropped it on the floor, snuffing it out with one of his dusky loafers. 13 looked down at where the cherry had melted the linoleum and shook his head. Dorian, Cornerstone is here in the observation room, so please keep your disrespect to a minimum today. Dorian put his hands up.
Whatever Ziggurat pleases. Just don't disrupt my process, even if you question my methods.
He pulled a prescription bottle bearing a stranger's name from his inside pocket of his blazer and popped a small blue pill. 13 looked at him questioningly as he slid the bottle back into his pocket. Dorian cleared his throat.
Morphine. Part of my process. Also, before we begin, I want to make certain that payment will be wired to my accounts upon completion of the assignment.
When have we not paid you? 13 asked with a hint of annoyance. Dorian put his tongue to the corner of his mouth and nodded.
By all means, proceed.
13 led Dorian down the hall. The voices from within the bullpen stopped as the Ziggurat operatives within watched him go by. They passed keycard-locked rooms until they reached the end of the hall. There was a lonely door there, adorned with a sign in both English and Arabic that read, "Do not proceed without proper PPE." 13 punched a button on the wall to his left, and a compartment popped out beside him. He pulled two noise-canceling Bluetooth headsets from within and then slid it closed. He proffered one to Dorian. There is a little button on the side. It is press to talk. Dorian nodded and donned the headset, tapping the button on the side.
I'm ready.
13 opened the thick metal door to reveal a tall woman in a cornflower blue suit with features both dark and elegant. Cornerstone. She spoke in a low tone and a slight Hindi accent. Ah, you are here. We are desperately in need of a professional of your caliber, Dr. Shade. Dorian hated that nickname. The moniker had been given to him by the previous head of Ziggurat. The current Cornerstone had succeeded him after he bought the farm on assignment.
Call me Dorian.
Cornerstone nodded. As you can see, the last esoteric surgeon we sent in did not fare well. She pushed a button and the steel shutter blocking the two-way mirror rolled up to reveal a little girl in a blue dress huddled in the corner. She had flaming red hair, but other than that, Dorian couldn't see her features. He took in the scene and let out a whistle. A man in a black suit lay unmoving on the tile floor, his clothes soaked from the blood pooling beneath him. 13 sighed. Milton? As if stating his name granted some kind of respite from what was on the other side of that glass. The sigil of the 5th star was strewn about the walls, each instance surrounded by a spiraling cuneiform script. The wedge-shaped writing had been penned in dripping crimson, parts of Milton slowly sliding down the wall. Cornerstone looked away. He was one of our best surgeons. She said something in Hindi, then switched back to English. The previous Cornerstone left a mixture of notes regarding you. Some of them are quite damning, yet I've read your complete dossier. Cornerstone paused and looked him over. 4 years studying under the shamans of various tribes in Siberia, 5 spent with Santeria practitioners in Brazil, and 3 with witch doctors in Africa. To name your highlights. Your reputation precedes you. What I see before me is hard to reconcile with what I have seen on paper. Hopefully, the good outshines the bad. She clasped her hands in front of her. Tell me you know what to do here, Dr. Dorian. Dorian lit a cigarette and gave a non-committal shrug. He wasn't a real medical professional. He was something else.
I am him, Dorian Black, Esoteric Surgeon, Esquire, etc.
Then he snapped his lighter closed.
And you forgot Australia.
13 started. I told you, you can't smoke in here. Cornerstone cut him off with a wave of her hand. Dorian tilted his head back slightly to look at 13 as he let out a plume of smoke, the cigarette hanging from his lip.
Don't disrupt my process. I can assure you, it only gets worse.
He shifted his gaze back to Cornerstone.
So, what have you told the parents?
13 cut in with a mechanical answer. We told them we are with the WHO, that their daughter contracted Ebola and is now under quarantine. Of course, the parents will have to be dealt with eventually, Cornerstone added with a cough.
You guys are sick, truly,
Dorian replied. He turned toward the door leading into the observation room.
Is there anything else I should know before I head in there?
Everyone snapped their heads toward the two-way mirror as their peripherals caught movement from within the containment room. The little girl turned from the corner and stuck her right leg out, then her right hand. She repeated the process with her other limbs, like an insect after a lighter had been taken to their antennae. She bumped into the two-way mirror, and her foggy breaths marked the glass as she tried to peer in with one of her pale blue eyes. 13 stepped back. Do you think she can see us? Dorian rolled his neck from side to side with an audible crack.
Just like any other animal, it can smell your fear.
13 brushed imaginary dust from his black suit and straightened himself, eyes darting around the room as always.
Whatever happens, don't let anyone in or out of this room until I tell you it's safe to do so. I'm ready,
Dorian said. Cornerstone nodded and pushed another button. Good luck. The thing inside lifted its head, using the poor girl like a marionette, snapping its gaze towards the door. Dorian made for the entrance and was there in 2 strides, slamming it closed behind him. He sighed in relief at the beeping of the locking mechanism. The little girl shook her disheveled head of red locks, now resembling dreads. Please, help me, came a whimpering voice from the vessel before him. A laugh followed as the little girl snapped her head up. Then she crawled across Milton's body with insect-like mannerisms, blood smearing across her blue dress. It attempted human speech and succeeded. So we meet face to face.
Yes, it's good to see you too, Harbinger. What are you called?
Dorian inched forward, smearing the sticky red liquid beneath his loafers. This thing gritted its teeth through the little girl, then slithered about Milton's body and took a bite from Milton's hand, leaving a red nub where his ring finger had been. The little girl's body shook like a rabbit in its death throes, coughing mechanically until it expelled Milton's wedding ring. The gold band shed coagulated blood and viscous black fluid as it bounced along the tile, rolling to a stop at Dorian's feet. It looked up at Dorian and said, I am Anotech. Leave me this vessel, and I shall make you a ruler upon this earth. All you have to do is open the door.
Shut the fuck up for a minute, you piece of celestial waste.
Dorian went to extinguish his smoke in the blood, but took a long drag instead. He let it burn and popped another opiate.
What makes you worth more than that which you inhabit?
Dorian growled, flicking his cigarette at the little girl. The thing inhabiting it moved back with a brief hiss.
See? I've learned a thing or two about your kind. 1, you don't like fire. 2, you can get inside my head as long as I can understand your communication. So go on, let's figure this out. I'll save 3 for later,
Dorian said. Wait, do not remove your head! 13's voice trailed off into oblivion as Dorian threw the headphones. They slid across the wet tiles, coming to rest at the entity known as Anotech's feet. Put your headphones back on, Cornerstone said over the intercom. Dorian rolled his shoulders as he stared at that thing. He imagined a shield of blue light around himself, attempting to make it real with every fabric of his being. That thing peered back with a smile that defied human capability. The whispers began. Abstract thoughts rang with irrefutable truth. He could kill himself if he wanted. There were plenty of objects to do so. He could light himself on fire, or maybe smash his head against the wall until it looked like a jack-o'-lantern in mid-November. He could even slit his own throat with the key card, slogging the dull plastic back and forth as Milton had done. Dorian laughed, softly at first, then loudly. After a few seconds, it turned into a smoker's cough. He cleared his throat.
So, this is what you hope to find within me. I can assure you there is nothing you can compel me to do that I haven't already considered.
Dorian sat cross-legged on the floor and took a deep breath. The entity cocked the head of its marionette and mirrored his position, seeming to only look through the left eye of the inhabited vessel. Then it bit into the air, clicking its teeth. So, you commune willingly. It smiled as wide as is possible for a human girl, blood trailing at the corners of her lips. Dorian curled his own lips downward, pulling a small vape pen from within his blazer. He pushed the button on the side and inhaled for as long as he could manage. Then he exhaled.
This is a little substance I learned of in the Amazon, extracted from the seed of a sacred plant. You know it?
Anotech clicked its teeth in rhythms that Dorian assumed were communication.
Yeah, you know it. Let's talk.
Dorian trailed off after his second hit from the vape pen. The world before him vanished, and blood-soaked tiles became flourishing fields of crimson poppies. The red flowers bloomed under a black sun, offering an unfathomable immensity that stretched on under strange stars, rising and falling independently. The astral plane was always disorienting, and Dorian righted himself as quickly as possible. He could see the little girl up ahead, moving away from him. Thoughts came slowly here, but he made sure to imagine the bright blue light radiating from within himself before journeying further. He followed the little girl, keeping his distance as she brushed her fingertips through the poppies. In the sky, two balloon-like constructions collided, exploding in a spiral of colors. It was mesmerizing, distracting. Dorian shook his head and focused on the task at hand. The girl led him to a lush forest, yet the poppies surrounding the trees wilted as she approached the tree line, their bright red petals fading to a sickly gray. Dorian stopped and watched her walk beyond the trees, limbs bending and retracting as she passed underneath and into the darkness. He reached for a cigarette, but they were not there. Nothing in his pockets. Dorian took a breath and conjured a lucky strike, then he put his fingers to it and lit it. Mind over matter here, always imagining that blue light radiating good intention outward from within. Other than that, the options were limitless, and perhaps that's why the astral plane was so dangerous. The tall trees withered just as the flowers had, wilting further whenever his gaze met their foliage. Dorian stomped out his imaginary cigarette as he reached the edge of the forest, listening intently. There were no bird songs. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, no creaking of tree limbs. Only silence and darkness. Dorian stepped into the forest after her, his blue aura fading to a dull gray until it was finally drowned into that insidious shade. He could hear the girl skipping ahead, singing softly. Ring around the rosy, pockets full of posies, ashes, ashes. The thick dark wrapped about Dorian like a noose. It was like a hot mist over a brackish mire. He wiped sweat from his brow, flinching as a twig snapped off in the distance. He strained his eyes, but was blinded in that blackness. Dorian tried to reimagine that blue light, every good intention. He could save her. He would save her. Yet he felt nothing but depression. The weight of a thing he had, until this moment, not considered. What if he couldn't save her? The radiant blue light never came. Something crunched as it stepped on dried leaves out in that darkness. Whatever that thing was, it had more than two legs. He tried to imagine a source of light, a flame, maybe a flare, anything. Dorian felt the hard metal of a Zippo in his palm. It was all he could conjure in that black fog. He flicked it frantically. The girl's voice echoed in the trees as the thing approached, sounding more massive with every stride. We all fall down. With a final flick, the little flame illuminated a small space around him Then he saw it. Dorian's hands shook with fear, and he dropped the book. The sterile white walls of the observation room in Cairo were gone, replaced with the cigarette-stained walls of his dimly lit apartment. How long had he been staring at that page, at that sigil? Dorian tucked the memory away as best he could and slowly removed the manila envelope from the strongbox. There was something with weight at the bottom. He ripped it open, then tipped it upside down. A silver watch fell into his lap. Dorian lifted the thing and began inspecting it. The numbers on the clock face were not the typical Roman or Arabic numerals. They were strange and alien. He wasn't sure if it even told time. Perplexed, he set it aside. There was a letter in the envelope as well. Dorian read the details outlined within, then flicked his Zippo, that little token that grounded him to reality, and lit the corner, letting the burning paper fall into the empty waste bin. Ziggurat had come to the same conclusion. This was more than just the mad scrawling of someone who knew Akkadian. This was a calling card, an invitation, and it was addressed to Dorian.